Hi everyone, it's Erin from the Provincial Farmhouse. Today I've put together a collection of 10 old tray makeovers. For my first project, I'm going to be working on this metal tray that I thrifted. To prime the surface, I'm going to use Paint Couture's 2-in-1 primer. I'm going to be doing 2 coats on this piece. Now, some of you may not like that I'm painting this tray, but I'm not sure if you guys noticed, but it had a lot of cup marks on the center part, and honestly, this is just going to give it a lovely refresh and it will work so much better in my home. When my 2 coats of primer were dry, I took Paint Couture's Buttercream chalk paint and I'm going to be applying 2.5 even coats. I'm using my size 12 Eco brush to apply the paint. It has a tapered end, so I'm able to get into all of the details that are around the outside. I often have people ask me if I paint the back of the trays. Sometimes I do if they are very damaged. Otherwise, I clean up the back because I like to have that pop of the original silver metal showing underneath. When my paint was dry, I took out IOD's new Joie de Roses transfer. I've already used 2 and a bit sheets on a previous project, and today we're going to be using 2 more sheets. I love that little section with the bird on it, so we're going to do that one and the piece that matches to it and sort of finishes off that scene. So I'm just laying the transfer sheets down on top of the tray, working out how much I'm going to be able to fit there, creasing it, and also then trimming it out. The grid lines are definitely a big help here. Once I'm happy with how that's looking, I peel off the backing sheet and I'm just going to position my transfer design where I want it to go and then press down. Now this has a curved outer surface, so I did have to improvise a little bit when it came to getting that transfer to work in the corners. I sort of had to actually cut the corners a little bit. I made little cuts here and there to help the transfer go down a little bit easier, and ultimately I do end up getting a few cracks, but because this particular transfer has an aged cracked finish anyway, it kind of worked out anyway, so I wasn't too worried about that. So here you can see I've just made a little cut there in the transfer sheet. I'm really working that transfer design into that curved corner there, and again, just working in sections definitely helps. Once I have the top right hand corner transfer organized, I'm going to focus on the bottom right hand corner. I'm just going to make a little cut so that it's a bit easier to get that design in that corner, and you can see I've just held up one part of the transfer while I rub and burnish part of that design in the corner, then I've laid down the other one, and that just really helped me get the entire design in the corner. I repeated that process in the other corners of the tray as well. Once I have those sections organized, I picked up a corner of the plastic, and you can see I'm lifting it as I am rubbing that transfer down, and that definitely helps it to release. When it came to the edges of the transfer, I didn't mind if I had some overlap happening because I was able to either pull it off or I just painted over the top of it. Once I removed that excess from the top there, I burnished the transfer with part of the carrier sheet. Now I'm working out the other section. I've trimmed it to size, and then I'm going to line it up so that the 2 designs join up. On this particular transfer, the different sections join up along a wavy line, which I feel really complements the vintage and worn nature of this transfer design. It's definitely a new favorite for me. Once I have the entire transfer down, I'm using the carrier sheet to burnish it a bit further, and then I'm going to seal the entire transfer with Paint Couture's Extreme Guard in satin. I'm going to do 2 coats. At this point, I had a look at the left hand side and the right hand side and thought that I actually liked when the design went all the way up to the edge of the tray. So I'm actually going to cut out another part of the transfer so that the design goes all the way up, if that makes sense. sense. On the left hand side you can see that it's a solid line along the edge. On the right hand side it's that wavy transition line. So this is going to fix that up and help the two sides look a bit more cohesive. So I've trimmed out what I need, and now I'm just going to rub that design down, and it will look like it's never been apart. Once I finished applying the transfer and removing the excess, I did seal over the top of it, and then I came in with a little bit more of that buttercream chalk paint, and I'm actually just going to paint over the top of any of the areas where we had some overlap of the transfer that I wasn't able to remove. Doing this is just going to tidy up that edge. When my paint was dry, I then took Paint Couture's Van Dyke Brown Glaze, and I'm going to go over the top of the entire tray. I'm starting off on the outside frame section there of the tray, and I just love how this glaze catches all of the ornate details. It just really highlights all of those beautiful curves. So I'm going to continue adding that glaze, and then I will be using a wet wipe to pull back some of the excess. Now I do love a vintage antiqued look, so this is definitely the look that I'm going for. However, if this is too grungy for you, obviously you could leave this particular step out. Now you can see that I am wiping back the excess, and again those curves have really been highlighted beautifully. When I get to the center of the tray, however, you can see I'm wiping, but I also then alternate from wiping to dabbing off that particular glaze. And I really love this technique because when you're using a wet wipe, it also distributes little water droplets that are colored that make it look like age spots. So it's definitely a very fun technique. So I'm just going to continue doing this, working my way around the tray until each section of the tray has that glaze and then has some of that excess wiped back. Once my glaze was completely dry, I then took Paint Couture's Bronze Luxe Metallic, and I'm going to be adding it around the outside of the tray. I began by adding it in a dabbing and sort of stippling motion. I don't want full coverage here. I want this to look like faded gilding that has worn away over time with use, so definitely not going for full coverage here. Once I finished adding that bronze to the outside sections of the tray, I took a wet wipe, the same one that I was using with the glaze, and now I am dabbing at that bronze metallic and pulling back some of that. I'm also adding a little bit of the glaze, so it's giving it a bit more of an antiqued look. And at this point, I did also decide to come in with a cleaner wipe and to pull back just a little bit more of that bronze to make it look a bit more weathered and worn. At this point, I decided to come in with a bit more of that Van Dyke Brown Glaze, and I'm going to work it into the corners where the transfer had some little cracks. I felt like adding this glaze would help tie in the cracks that had formed as I worked it into the corners. I felt like that would tie it in a bit more with the cracks that are already present on this particular transfer design. And as you can see, I'm then wiping back some of the excess with a wet wipe. And here's our finished French Country tray. I love how this turned out. I feel like that transfer works so perfectly with this tray, and I really feel like it looks very elegant. Let me know what you think of this in the comments. My final project, I'm going to be working on this little metal tray. I'm going to prime it with Paint Couture's 2-in-1 primer in grey first. Again, I'm just applying it with a chip brush, and it's going to take 2 coats to make sure that our surface is properly primed. When my primer was dry, I took Paint Couture's Farmhouse Linen, just like we did in the other few projects, and I'm going to be applying it over the entire tray. Again, it is going to take 3 coats to get the coverage that I want. I tried to keep my colors pretty similar because I did want this to look like a bit of a cohesive collection. When my paint was dry, I took this lovely cow design from IOD's La Campagne stamp. It's going to go in the center. I'm going to ink it up with IOD's China Blue ink. We're switching back to that one again, and I'm going to press that down in the center. I did keep the backing on this particular stamp as we are working on a flat surface. I then took IOD's Veranda stamp, and I'm going to be working with the 2 larger floral designs. I'm going to ink them up. I'm going to position them on an angle and then press down. Now I am working over the top of quite a few curves here, so we're not going to get a perfect impression. I did work hard to really press that design into all of those different grooves and curves, but again, it's not going to be perfect, but that's okay. It will just fit in with our vintage and worn look. I added the same stamp on the left-hand side there, again just sort of continuing that pattern around, and then after that I did actually ink up the other design that matches it, but the flowers are facing in the opposite direction, and I positioned that up the top and pressed down, just mimicking what we did on the left hand side. Ultimately, what I want to do is frame out this lovely cow. I've seen that on a lot of transferware platters, and I really wanted to recreate that look. I then flipped the tray upside down and repeated the same process as we did up the top, but down the bottom. I then took my China Blue ink pad and I ran it around the top edge of our tray. I heat set my ink with a hairdryer, and then I took it outside and sealed it with Rust-Oleum's Clear Matte Sealer. I then came in with Paint Couture's Crackle Step 1, and I'm going to apply it over the entire tray. I am also doing some cross hatching here and there as well. I then let this dry for about 30 minutes. It did then become sticky and tacky to the touch, and then I came in with Crackle Step 2 and applied it in the exact same way. Again, we're going for a very vintage look, and from a lot of the photos that I've seen, the transferware that I really love has a lot of crazing, and that's exactly what I'm trying to recreate here. After about an hour, I came in with Paint Couture's Van Dyke Brown Glaze. I'm going to apply the glaze over the entire tray, and again, if this look isn't for you, just leave this particular step out. So I'm going to cover the entire tray, and then once I'm happy with the coverage and I can see a lot of that crackle that we created, I'm going to take a wet wipe and start pulling that glaze back. Sometimes I'm dabbing, sometimes I'm swiping it away. Once my wet wipe becomes too dirty, I do change to a new one so that I can wipe back more of that product. And at times I also use a paper towel as well. How much you take back will be up to you. I still want to be able to see a lot of that lovely crackle so we can get that crazing look. But again, up to you and how crackled you want it to look. If you don't have access to Crackle, IOD do have a stamp called the Vintage Textures stamp, and there is a crackle design in that pack that you could use instead. And here's a look at our final project. I love how this turned out. Those stamps work beautifully together, and I really feel like that crackle finishes it off perfectly. Let me know what you think of this in the comments. All of today's projects, I'm going to be using Redesign's Toile de Jouy decoupage paper. I am a huge fan of anything toile. I have a lot of it in my home and I just could not wait to try out this design. There are so many gorgeous provincial scenes here that I just had to use in my projects today. My first project is this silver tray. It is metal, but obviously it's a little bit banged up. We're going to give it a makeover. I'm going to be using Paint Couture's Prima in grey, and I'm just applying that with a paintbrush. This has already been cleaned. Definitely important that you don't skip that step. I'm going to do one coat, let it dry for a few hours, do another coat, and then let that dry for a few hours as well. Once I'd given my primer enough time to dry and cure, I took out Paint Couture's Cozy Beige chalk paint. I am applying that over the top of the primer. Now I'm going to do 2 coats, but this has great coverage, so the second coat was quite light and really sort of only like a touch-up coat. This is a really lovely sort of taupe sort of tone. It's got a lot of creamy undertones as well, and I felt like it tied in well with the background color of the Redesign decoupage design. I let both of the coats dry and then I took out the decoupage paper to work out which design I was going to feature in the center. I love this little cottage scene here, so I'm just using my fingernails to make little indents as a guide to help me cut out what I'm going to need. And then I went in and sort of rounded the edges. I'm just going to be having that sitting in the bottom section and just sort of stopping before it starts to go up that edge. I'm going to be using Paint Couture's Decoupage Medium in matte, and I'm just applying that medium to the bottom section of the tray where the decoupage is going to go. I'm going to be quite generous here, especially with the weight of this paper. It's a lot thicker, so you want to make sure you're being very generous with your product. I'm then going to position it down in the center and smooth it out, and then I'm going to apply another generous layer over the top to seal everything in. As I was working on this project, it definitely reminded me a lot of some of the transfer wear styles that I had seen in the past, and it was just so fun to be able to finally use this paper. I do have it on my website if you're in Australia and you'd like to try it. When that was dry, I took out Paint Couture's Crackle Step 1 and I'm going to be applying it over the entire tray. I did start off thinking I was only going to be applying it to the edges and on that transition line to try and blend the entire piece together a bit more, but I actually decided to go over the entire thing. I felt like that brought the piece together a bit better. You could actually see some of the cracks over the top of the decoupage paper as well, so I think it was definitely the right move. I let that dry for about 30 minutes and then came in with Paint Couture's Crackle Step 2. You'll know that the Step 1 is ready when it feels sticky and tacky to the touch. That means it's ready to go. And once I had finished applying Crackle Step 2, I let that dry for about 2 hours. Once the crackle medium was completely dry, I took out Paint Couture's Light Brown Sugar Antiquing Glaze and I'm applying this over the entire tray. I am going to work in sections, however, so that I've got enough time to wipe back some of that excess with a wet wipe, especially over the decoupage section, even though it is obviously really sealed in with that crackle medium. I just wanted to be sure that I would have a even look to this piece. So I'm just going to work my way around applying that lovely glaze and really enjoying the look as it settles into all of those cracks. Now, if you don't have a crackle medium, an alternative to this could be IOD's Vintage Textures stamp that does have the crackle stamp in that. That's definitely a good option. Obviously, my vision for this piece was to create something that looked like it had been around for many years and had really gained that antiqued sort of a look. If you don't have access to glaze, you could use a wax for this step, or you could create a brown paint wash. Once the glaze was completely dry, I took out Paint Couture's Bronze Luxe Metallic and I'm going to just be adding it over the top of the outside border section. I again wanted it to look a little bit like faded gold gilding around the edge of the plate there. And again, it's up to you if you decide to add this step in. You could come in with the gold if you wanted. I did think about coming in with a blue that tied in with the center design, but in the end, bronze was definitely a good choice. I really love the shine that this brings. I then also took out a wet wipe, and I'm just pulling back a little bit of that to give that appearance of wear and tear. And here's a look at our finished tray. I'm really pleased with how this piece turned out. I think the decoupage design in the center has given this piece a whole new look. Let me know what you think of this in the comments. Of this tray for about $1, and I knew it would make the perfect base for some wall art. I'm going to be using Paint Couture's 2-in-1 primer in grey, and I'm going to be applying one coat, letting it dry for about an hour, and then applying another coat and letting that dry for another hour as well. This primer is not only going to prepare my surface for paint, but it will block any stains. I'm then going to be using Redesign's new Salon de Glace mold. I'm pouring out some of my quick set resin, equal parts A and B, and then once I have that mixed properly, that takes about 30 to 40 seconds, I'm going to be pouring them into my molds. Now, it does take about 10 to 15 minutes for them to set, but this is definitely something that you want to use as opposed to clay, because it will become rigid and be able to hold its form without breaking. If you place clay on something that isn't fully supported by the back, you might find that it crumbles and falls off. So we definitely need to use resin for today's project. As I'm pouring my resin, I'm just going around and making sure that I have that resin in each of the sections of this mold. It took about 60 mils to fill this entire set here, so keep that in mind if you're going to try this. And as you can see, I'm just going around making sure every little section is filled. After about 10 minutes, my pieces are ready to come out. So I'm gently pulling the resin out of my mold, and I'm just having a bit of a play with how I'm going to position it. This particular design, however, I am going to be splitting in two. So I'm going to use my craft knife to cut the top section of that mold off. And always keep this in mind, you don't have to use your molds as is. You can either partially cast them in clay if you're going to be working with clay, or like I am, I'm just using my craft knife to cut it. You can also use some sandpaper or just lightly use your knife to reshape it. So this particular design is going to sit at the top of our tray, and obviously I'm going to put the other one down the bottom. I'm using Gorilla Super Glue Gel to attach my castings today, and ultimately, as you've probably guessed, we are trying to create a frame, an ornate frame that is going to go around the outside there. So if you're going to try this, it will be up to you as to how many of these molds you're going to attach. So I have my glue on the back there. I'm just pressing it down on top of my tray until it's secure. This only takes about a minute with this particular glue. I'm then going to repeat the same process, adding glue to each of the different pieces and holding it down until it's secure. As I only just cast these particular resin pieces, they are still flexible. If you are dealing with pieces that you have cast a little while ago, I suggest that you use a heat gun. You can see I have mine sitting there to the left just in case I need to add a little bit more heat to get it to bend and manipulate the way I want. But definitely add that heat before you try to bend your molds, because you may risk snapping them. Once my castings were all glued down and the glue had thoroughly dried, I took that 2-in-1 primer by Paint Couture again, and I'm just going to go over the top of my castings. You don't always need to do this. However, I felt that it would be good to just make sure I had that added bit of insurance that the paint was going to stick and stay there. Once my primer was completely dry, I took Paint Couture's Crust Medium, and I'm going to take out one part of that product and put it in a plastic container, and then I'm going to take 2 parts of Paint Couture's Embossing Medium, and we are going to mix those together. Once that mixture was thoroughly mixed together, I took Paint Couture's Pinecone Chalk Paint, that is a brown tone, and I'm just going to add a few drops of that paint to tint our mixture. I'm then going to mix that all together well. Next, I'm going to take a palette knife and I'm going to start applying it to the outside rim of the tray. Ultimately, what I want to create here is texture. I want it to look almost like an old plaster frame, and I'm going to be concentrating that mixture around the outside edge of the tray. Doing this is going to help it look less like a tray and more like an old oval frame. As I'm applying this around the outside, I'm switching between using the palette knife and also a paintbrush, and I am dabbing and stippling that product on at times. I think that in some places it might even look like rust or maybe just chips in an old wooden frame. I'm also making sure to add it in between each of my castings so we have that continuation of the texture so that it all feels like a cohesive piece. If I inspire you to try any of these Paint Couture products, I would really appreciate it if you would use my affiliate link. I will put it in the description and on the screen. I just get a little thank you from Paint Couture in return. Once I'm finished adding the mixture to the outside rim of the frame, I'm also going to go over the top of the castings themselves with what I have left in my container. This is going to again help make it look like it's all cohesive and one design, and it's also going to give some age to those castings and make them look like less like resin and more like perhaps plaster or carvings. I let this dry completely, and then I came in with Paint Couture's Buttercream chalk paint, and I'm going to go in and apply that paint over the entire tray. Now we are going to be adding some decoupage in the center, so it's a good idea to have a light background behind your paper so that the colors remain vibrant and really pop. But I'm also going to be adding it to the outside of the frame as well. However, when I'm adding it to the outside section, I'm going to be a little bit heavier. We are going for texture, we are going for age here, so I'm happy for it to go on a lot thicker, and hopefully we will get a little bit more texture out of applying it in this way. So I'm going to continue adding that paint around the outside, and it is going to take 2 coats as well to get the coverage that I want. After I finished applying each coat of the buttercream, I did come in with my hairdryer and I sped up the drying process after each coat. It was my hope that this would add to that texture and look of age. Next, I'm going to be using an older design by Posh Chalk, and this is called Floral Palette. This is a rice paper by Would You Bend, and I am just loving the old world feel that this design has. So I'm going to position it where I want it to go, and you can see I'm just sort of plotting that out, using my nails a little bit to work out which part of the design is going to be visible and which part I want to leave out. I definitely wanted some of that darkness down the bottom there and then that contrasting light section. I'm now running my fingernail along the edge of the tray where I want my paper to stop so that I've got a bit of a guide when I come in with my scissors. And then I'm going to come in and cut out my design, but I am leaving about 1 to 2 centimeters around the edge just to be sure that I have enough of that paper in the tray and that I haven't made any errors. Once I'm happy with how it's going to look, I'm going to be taking Paint Couture's Decoupage Medium in Matte, and I'm going to be laying down a generous amount of that product just in the section where we want our decoupage design to go. So you want to make sure you have a generous amount there so that it doesn't dry before you get your paper down, but I'm also being careful not to get it on the outside rim where we've created that frame design. So I only want it in those sections so it makes it a bit easier for me to cut the excess excess off later. So once I'm happy with the amount of product I have down, I'm going to position the decoupage paper where I want it to go, and then I'm going to start pressing it down. You'll see I do reposition it a couple of times, and that's okay as long as you do that before the decoupage paper has time to soak in too much of that product, because it does become a little bit brittle when you do this. And now you can see I'm using my brush to really start smoothing that paper down. I'm also ripping it in certain sections, just adding a few little rips here and there where we have to manipulate it around those castings. And again, just using my brush to smooth it all out. I only have a little bit of product on my brush at this point. Once I'm happy with how it's laying, I'm going to come in with another coat of that decoupage medium to seal everything down. Once my piece was completely dry, I took a craft knife and I'm just going to go around the edge, and I'm going to make some little cuts along the edge there of the frame so that we can cut off the excess. Now, I was very careful not to get any product on the outside section of the frame, but I'm using a knife here to be sure that I don't accidentally rip off more than I want. Ordinarily, when I'm trying to trim off excess decoupage paper, I would use some sandpaper, but because of the shape of our project today, it's just better if I come in with a craft knife to remove the excess. Once I have all of the excess paper removed, I did come in with a bit more of that decoupage medium to seal down the edges. When that was dry, I came in with Paint Couture's Amber Honey Antiquing Glaze. This is a new one. I have not used this before. I would say it's in between Van Dyke Brown Glaze and Light Brown Sugar Glaze, so it's a nice happy medium. You can see I'm applying it, and then I'm coming in with a wet wipe and dabbing off some of the excess. I am going to allow quite a bit more of this product to sit down in those details because I want the frame to look quite vintage and antique, and this glaze is really going to achieve that. So I'm really working it into the details of our castings there, and I love how when you add a glaze, an antiquing glaze, it really just highlights those details even further. I'm then coming in with a wet wipe and pulling that back. Again, I'm really going to allow a lot of that excess to sit down in those low points. So I'm just going to continue working my way around the frame section there, adding the antiquing glaze and pulling it back, and I'm loving how it's catching the texture that we created, adding that crust and embossing medium mix. It just really is giving this quite an antiqued look. If this was a bit too grungy for you, however, you could obviously leave this step out. Once my glaze was completely dry, I took Paint Couture's Bronze Luxe Metallic, and I've just got a little bit on my paintbrush, and I'm going to go around and add it to some of the details on our castings. I do not want it to be perfect. I want this to look like faded and worn away gilding, so I'm just going around and hitting a few of the places with that beautiful metallic. And remember, if you are using the Luxe Metallics by Paint Couture, they do become more vibrant as they dry. If bronze isn't for you, Paint Couture have a huge range of metallics. At this point, you could come in with a copper or a silver, or perhaps if you are leaving it a little bit more neutral, you could maybe come in with oyster pearl. That is definitely a beautiful, subtle shine. I'm envisioning that this piece will probably sit on a shelf or a sideboard to be displayed. However, I wanted the option for someone to be able to hang it if they wanted. So I did flip it over. You will notice I haven't painted it yet, but that is because of this step. I'm going to take this eye hook, and then I'm going to be using E6000. I'm going to scuff up the surface first, which is why we didn't bother painting, because we really need that direct contact between the glue and the object you're gluing it to. I'm going to put down a sort of generous little dab of that glue where I want my hanging attachment to go, and then I'm going to press it down in the product. I did then let it set for 24 hours, and then I came in and tidied up the back with some paint. And here's our finished French country art. I love how this turned out. It's hard to believe that that was once just a plain silver tray. Let me know what you think of this in the comments. If you enjoyed today's video, I would really appreciate it if you would hit that like button, comment, and share it out. For my first project, I'm going to be working on this silver, I believe it could be resin tray, and I'm going to prime it first with Paint Couture's 2-in-1 primer in grey. I'm using grey because that's what I have open, but I'm going to do one coat, let it dry for about an hour, then come in with my second coat and let that dry for several hours. I'm then going to be using IOD's brand new bows mold. Now this design has 2 different sizes of bows and it has the tail ends of the ribbons as well. I'm going to add some cornstarch to the smaller of the bow designs, and then I'm going to work my air dry clay into the mold. And you can see I'm sort of following the shape of the bow and pushing and working that clay into it. And then I'm going to use my fingers to start pushing out the excess. That micro rim is definitely a really big help here. It helps you get a much cleaner edge. I'm then going to begin to flex the mold, helping that clay to release. Then I'm going to flip it over and start to bend that mold back, and gravity is going to help me get my casting out. I'm going to be positioning the bow on the center parts of the tray, and then I'm going to start casting some of the other pieces of the ribbon. I did end up casting the larger ribbon tail designs, as I felt like this was a better scale for my tray. So I'm going to be putting this casting on the right hand side of the bow, sort of stretching it around the tray, and then adding the other one to the other side. I'm going to be doing the same thing on the other side of the tray, and then I'm going to add some wood glue to the back of my castings and put them in place. Now my clay is still wet. You want to do this before your clay sets so that you can mold it to your surface. Once all my clay castings were glued down, I let them dry overnight, and the next day I came in with Paint Couture's buttercream chalk paint, and I'm going to be applying 3 coats of this creamy tone over the entire tray. And I'm being really careful with how much product I add around the castings so that I don't get little pools of paint. Once my 3 coats of paint were completely dry, I took out IOD's brand new Rose Botanical Transfer. This is an 8-page transfer full of gorgeous florals, lots of different sizes. You've also got some lovely script writing that you can use and layer. And honestly, this is definitely going to be one of my new favorites. The colors are just absolutely stunning. So I'm going to be picking a design to go in the center of my tray. This is the one that I decided on. I'm just going to put it in the center and do a bit of a crease where I'm going to have to cut. The grid lines on the IOD transfers are really a big help here as well for working out where I'm going to cut. I'm also going to be separating the text from my designs. I don't want that much text, and I also want to be able to position the writing exactly where I want it to go. I'm then going to peel the backing off, and I'm going to then press the design in the center. Again, the grid lines are a big help with this. I'm then going to use the transfer stick that comes with the transfer pack, and I'm going to go over the top of the entire design to get the whole thing stuck down. And then once that's all stuck down in place, I'm going to pick a corner and start lifting that plastic up as I am rubbing. And you can see how easily these transfers adhere to your surface. I'm just going to work my way around, gently pulling that up and rubbing and transferring that image as I go. Once the image is transferred, I'm going to cut off a smaller piece of the carrier sheet and use that to rub and burnish my design down, making sure it's all in place. And then I am going to add some of the text down in the bottom left-hand corner. I'm then going to be using Paint Couture's Extreme Guard in Satin to seal my transfer and the entire tray. Once my sealer is completely dry, I took out Paint Couture's Van Dyke Brown Glaze, and I'm going to be really working it into the details from the bows mold. I'm really focusing on the crevices, and I really feel like the glaze is going to highlight the beautiful shape of these castings. So once I've finished adding it, I'm just going to work in sections. I'm going to grab a wet wipe and start wiping back some of the excess. I don't want this to be too dark, but again, I want it to highlight the details in this mold and give my piece more of a aged and worn, sort of shabby look. So I'm going to continue to wipe that back until I'm happy with the look, and then I'm going to repeat the same process on the rest of the outside of the tray. You can see I haven't gone in heavy at all in the center. What I'm going to be doing is using the wet wipe to pull some of that glaze into the center while still keeping it a bit lighter. I'm then going to go in and start dabbing with the wet wipe that I've been using. This is going to help create some age spots. When that was dry, I took the brush that I used with the buttercream chalk paint and I'm offloading most of the paint, and then I'm going to go in and start doing a little bit of dry brushing just on the bow details, just to bring a bit of lightness, to add a little bit more depth to my project. I'll also go around the outside edges of the tray and repeat this as well. When that was dry, I went around the edges of my bows with Paint Couture's Bronze Luxe Metallic. I don't want to get full coverage. I want the edges and the curves to be highlighted by this beautiful metallic, but in a subtle way. Finally, I took out IOD's Vintage Textures stamp. This is the crackle stamp from that collection, and I am using IOD permanent black ink, and I'm going to randomly press and lightly press parts of the crackle stamp over the inside section of the tray, and then I'll use a wet wipe to pull back some of that product to soften the look. And here's a look at our finished tray. I love how this turned out, and I am obsessed with IOD's new bows and rose botanical transfer. I think they go perfectly together. Let me know what you think of this in the comments. First project, I'm going to be working on this little white wooden tray. Now, I actually really like how it looks at the moment. It looks weathered and worn, so we're just going to be working on the center. I'm going to be using Recycled's Spring Blocks Decoupage Paper. Now, I have these listed on my website, so if you're in Australia, you can grab those there. I'm going to be particularly focusing on the beautiful design on the top right-hand corner. I think that would look perfect with this tray. So I'm going to trim that out, and I'm just being careful not to disturb or cut any of the designs next to it, because obviously we can use those for other projects. I then need to work out how much of this paper I'm actually going to be using. So I'm going to position the design inside the tray, and then I'm going to be using my fingernails to mark out and crease the areas that I'm going to have to trim off. As I'm doing this, I'm really making sure that the top bow section is going to be visible and that I have the design straight. I'm then going to use my scissors to trim off the excess. And as I'm cutting, I often leave a couple of millimeters of extra space just in case I have made any errors while I've been creasing. I don't want there to be any gaps. I also sometimes reposition the decoupage paper in the space where I'm cutting just to double check that I've got it correct. I'm then going to be using Paint Couture's Decoupage Medium in Matte. I'm going to apply a generous amount directly to the tray. Now, you could definitely paint the inside of the tray before applying your decoupage paper. Decoupage paper can be quite transparent, so you are going to be able to see some of the texture that's already there, but I've decided to embrace it. I feel like it might look a little bit odd to have a perfect center and a distressed exterior. So I'm just laying my paper down in the product, and then you can see here that I am smoothing that out. I just have a little ball of cling wrap that I'm using, and if I see any air bubbles, I just sort of lift that paper up, reposition it, and then again just using that cling wrap so that I don't create any friction with my fingers and create any tears. I'm going to continue to work in sections. I tend to do this when I have a bigger project. So just laying down that product and then smoothing the paper down over it. I also did use my mister to lightly mist the paper. I find that this helps the paper to stretch and also helps to minimize wrinkles. As I am securing down the last section, I'm just smoothing that out again with that little bit of cling wrap, and then I'm going to lay another coat of that decoupage medium over the top of the entire base of the tray. When the decoupage medium was dry, I took out Paint Couture's Bronze Luxe Metallic, and I'm just going to be applying it over the top of the ribbon design on this decoupage design. I'm going in heavier in the sections where there is less details, and then I'm going over lightly the sections that have more of the stripes and the details, using hardly any product in those sections. And I am really loving the shine that this is bringing. It's adding an extra element to it. And this is definitely something that you can do. You can go in and add colors or metallics like I am over the top of the decoupage designs just to add a bit of extra interest. And in my case, I feel like it adds a little bit of elegance as well. When the bronze was completely dry, I then took out my craft knife and I'm just going to go around the edges. My decoupage medium is completely dry as well, and I'm just going to cut and then peel back the excess paper. You just want to make sure that the decoupage is completely dry before you try this. And here's a look at our finished tray. I really love how this turned out. The tray itself was already beautiful, but adding the Recycled Spring Blocks decoupage paper has really just completed this project. Let me know what you think of this in the comments. The next project, I'm going to be giving this tray a makeover. It is a handmade piece and it is quite heavy. It felt a bit French country farmhouse to me. So I'm going to start by using Paint Couture's Basil chalk paint, and I'm going to be applying 2 coats around the outside and inside, except for the bottom of the tray on the inside. And something to note is that when you're using Paint Couture's chalk paint, it is a bit thinner than other brands, but that being said, as long as you stir it really well, you're not going to have any issues. The pigments are very vibrant. You will also find that because the paint is just a little bit thinner, that you will get a much flatter and smooth finish using this. As I was doing this, I did try my best not to get any of the green paint on the center part of the tray. I'm using my size 12 Eco brush and it is tapered, so it does make this job a bit easier. However, if you want a little bit more reassurance that you're not going to get any paint there, I suggest that you tape off the center section before you start. After my 2 coats of chalk paint are dry, I'm going to be taking Dixie Belle's Buttercream chalk mineral paint and I'm going to be adding that to the inside of our tray. I'm really loving the two-toned look at the moment, especially green paired with cream. I just love that combination. So I'm going to carefully go in, and you can see I'm really taking my time around the edges there, and I'm adding that beautiful cream paint. Now, it doesn't matter if this isn't perfect, if I miss certain areas, if that wood shows through, it does not matter. We are going for a bit of a farmhouse look here, so it doesn't need to be perfect. And so I'm going to continue adding that paint until I have the whole base covered, and I'm actually going to do 2 coats of paint before I move on to my next step. Once my 2 coats of buttercream are dry, I'm going to take IOD's Rose Chintz paint inlay, and I'm going to take out 1 sheet of this design. This has not been used before, and I'm going to start working out how much I'm going to need. So I'm going to lay it inside my tray first, and once I've done that, I am going to first trim off the border around the edge of your inlay. So each inlay has this border. You'll want to trim that off when you're doing your measuring, and then I'm actually putting the sheet inside the tray and doing some creases where I'm going to need to cut. And I did cut a couple of millimeters over just in case my measurements weren't quite right. So I'm just going to trim that to size before we move on. Next, I'm going to lay down an even coat of my buttercream chalk mineral paint again, and I'm working a little bit quicker than last time because when you're doing a paint inlay, you need to lay your paint inlay in wet paint. You cannot wait till it dries. It will not work because what happens is that your wet paint grabs the design on the paint inlay and the paint from the inlay stays as your paint dries. It is a very fun product to use. So while my paint's still wet, I'm going to press my paint inlay design side down. You can see that the grid is facing up at me, and I'm going to smooth that design into my wet paint gently. I don't want to press too hard. I don't want to squish that paint out, but I do want good contact. I'm then going to take a water mister and I'm going to mist my paper well, and then I'm also going to take a damp cloth there and I'm going to pat that down to make sure that my inlay is making good contact and I don't have any air bubbles. Once I've done that, I did take a craft knife and I made some little cuts in the little grooves that were made by the planks of wood because I want my inlay to be able to sit down and make contact with those sections so that I don't have such a broken design. So I'm just going to do that in each of those sections very gently and carefully. After I finished making my cuts, I misted my inlay a little bit more. Then I took my damp rag and applied just a bit more pressure in the areas where I had cut. Again, just making sure that that inlay design has made contact with the paint that's in the grooves. I then let this dry completely. After about an hour my inlay was dry, I then came in with my water mister again, and after 60 seconds I started the process of pulling this away. Now because I made those little cuts, it is going to come away in fragments. Now that's okay, I will just be using my inlay again on say a photo frame or something that requires thin strips or bits and pieces of the design, because you can reuse your paint inlay up to 3 times. So you can see I'm gently pulling my design away there. If I feel any resistance, I will just use my water mister again to dampen that paper, and I will put these off to the side to dry, and I'll use them again at a later date. Once I'm finished pulling my inlay away, I did take it outside and I used Rust-Oleum's satin spray sealer. If you brush on a water-based sealer on top of your inlay, you do risk smearing because obviously these are real paint pigments. So it's definitely suggested that you use a spray sealer before you come in with brushing a sealer on. Once my spray sealer is dry, I'm taking Paint Couture's Extreme Guard Satin Top Coat, and I'm going to seal the outside of the tray and do one more coat on the inside of the tray as well. When my clear coat is dry, I'm going to take Paint Couture's Light Brown Sugar Glaze, and I'm going to be working that into the center of the tray first. You can see I'm really letting it pool and accumulate in the grooves of our tray there, and I love how it's picking up the imperfections that my paint inlay caused in the paint. Now I love that look. I know it's not for everybody. I'm then going to take a baby wipe and I'm going to wipe back the excess, again letting that glaze sit in those grooves and highlight some of those imperfections. I was definitely going for a vintage look here. I almost wanted that to look like old wallpaper maybe that had come away from some old barn wood in the center there. I was just really having fun with this piece. Once I'd finished applying it to the center section, I did then decide to also add it to the rest of the tray because I really liked how it aged the paint finish, and it just all brought that whole piece together. Everything worked a lot better together and a lot more seamlessly once I added that glaze. So you can see I'm applying it and then I'm using that baby wipe, but I'm not necessarily just wiping it. I'm actually doing some dabbing and sort of pouncing because that's also creating some interesting patterns as well while I'm doing that. Again, very subtle because I am using a glaze over a darker color. And here's our finished tray. I love how this turned out. It's definitely giving me vintage vibes. Let me know what you think of this in the comments. For my final project, I'm going to be working on this tray. Now, yes, it already has farmhouse kitchen in the center, but it's a bit too generic. So I'm going to come in with Paint Couture's Simply White chalk paint, and I'm going to be adding 3 coats to get the coverage that I want, but only in the center section. I still want to have a wooden frame on the outside. I do love the two-toned look, so I think this will be quite an easy flip, but definitely very effective. Now, if you are going to try this and again you're a bit nervous about not getting paint in areas you don't want it, I definitely recommend adding that masking tape or having a wet wipe at the ready to wipe that back. In between coats, I did use my hairdryer to speed up the drying process because I found that occasionally I would get some really fun cracks and texture, and as we're going for a farmhouse look, this definitely fits that look. Next, I'm going to be using IOD's Mercantile stamp. I really love the layout of the design already, so I am just going to be taking my stamps off and positioning them. This Laurel design here was a little bit bigger than my tray, so I did have to manipulate it a little bit, have it a little bit more curved, but everything else, as you can see, I'm just positioning very similarly to how they appear on the stamp already, but just arranging it to fit my tray. Once I'm happy with that, I'm going to take out just a bit of plastic and I'm going to press that over the top of my stamps. I am doing this so that I can maintain that layout so that I know it's going to fit perfectly on my tray. I'm then going to be using my IOD permanent black ink over the top of the entire design, and if I get ink anywhere that I don't want it, I'm just going to use a wet wipe to pull that back. I'm then going to flip that over, position it in the center and press down. I'm then going to move my fingers around, applying pressure, also making sure that I always have one hand holding the stamp in place so that I don't have any shifting. And you can always have a little peek, lift the stamp up slightly to make sure that you've got the contact that you want, and then I'm going to pull it off. You would have seen there I had one hand holding it in the left in place and I've pulled it up from the side. That was just to make sure that everything stayed in place and didn't fall off. I'm then going to be using some elements from the Vintage Textures stamp. I'm inking up one of the designs that's meant to look like chippy paint, and then I'm just going to randomly press it into the background sections of my design. So again, no right or wrong way to do this. I'm just randomly pressing it. You'll see I'm just pressing bits and pieces of it down. I'm not putting the whole stamp down on my surface. I'm changing the angle and the orientation of the stamp and just really having a bit of a play with how that's going to look. I do really love these stamps. They definitely do look authentically worn and vintage. Once I was finished using that one, I took out this design here, and I think it's meant to be cracked paint, and this one is definitely a lot of fun. Again, just randomly pressing it down, not using the whole stamp. I'm really going for a weathered and worn paint look for this one, so I just had a bit of fun with this stamp. I then took out a wet wipe and I'm going to start wiping back some of that ink. It was a little bit darker than I wanted. I'm not going to wipe back the center stamp design that we've just done, just the distressing marks. And really, I think IOD ink is probably the only one that you can do this with without getting smudging. When my surface was dry, I took out Paint Couture's Van Dyke Brown Glaze, and I'm going to begin by adding it to the center and some of the inner corners and edges. I really want to have it sort of accumulating in those spots, and then I'm going to use a wet wipe to pull some of it back. Now, originally I was going to just only have it in the center, but I really liked how it was looking on the wooden sides and how it was toning that wood and giving it sort of a richer brown look to it. I felt like it would tie in better with the center section and the brown tone that we're creating there. So I do end up adding it to the outside. It felt like the wood wasn't completely sealed. This is just sort of a generic tray that I think I picked up at one of our dollar stores here in Australia. So I was able to use that glaze to tone the stain there, because Paint Couture's glazes can be used as a semi-gel stain as well. So now I'm just coming in and I'm pulling back some of that with a wet wipe, and you can see I'm dabbing more than I'm wiping in the center part. I find this gives a bit more of an authentically worn look rather than wiping it back. However, on the outside parts, on the wooden parts, I do wipe it back just to make sure I've got that even coverage over the top of the wood. I was definitely going for a more rustic, primitive look with this project, but if this isn't to your style, obviously you could leave the glaze out, or maybe you could even come in with a whitewash or a white wax to tone it down. You could add in some color in the center, stamp design. I, again, just wanted to keep it really simple and rustic looking. If I inspire you to try any of the Paint Couture products used in today's video, I would really appreciate it if you would use my affiliate link. I will put it in the description and on the screen. I just get a little thank you from Paint Couture in return. When the glaze was dry, I took out my IOD black ink pad again, and I'm just going to be running it along the edges of the tray, outside, inside, and on the corner edges. I really liked the hint of black that this brought, and it sort of tied the handles and the center design in with the rest of the tray. When the ink was dry, I then took out my Extreme Guard in Satin by Paint Couture, and I'm going to be sealing the entire tray, the inside design and also the outside part of the tray, because we've used that glaze to deepen the stain. And I'm just going to seal it all up so that if someone wants to actually put cups and plates and things on the tray, they'll be able to wipe up any spills. And here's a look at our finished tray. I'm really pleased with how this turned out. It definitely has a primitive farmhouse feel. Let me know what you think of this in the comments. For my final project today, I'm going to be working on this wooden tray that I thrifted. It actually reminded me a lot of lattice work. Now that has a lot of little sections. It would be a real pain to paint by hand, and I don't have a paint sprayer, so I'm going to take it outside and I'm going to be using White Night white flat spray paint. So it's just a very simple white paint. It has the built-in top coat as well, and I'm going to be giving this piece 2 coats. I don't mind if I don't get full coverage. In fact, I'm going to be doing some distressing anyway on this to bring back some of that black, so that is absolutely fine. And of course, I'm going to flip it over and paint the other side. When it was dry, I brought it inside, and now I'm going to grab out IOD's Petite Fleur Pink Again inlay, and I am going to be trimming these lovely long floral borders, and there's only 4 of them, but I'm going to space them out to have 2 up the top, 2 down the bottom, and have a gap in the center. I'm going to be using Extreme Guard in Satin again for this. I'm going to lay that project down the horizontal lines, but I'm also going to add some product to the vertical lines as well. Because of the shape of this inlay, we do have some bits and pieces going in all different directions, so I want to make sure there's enough product there. So I'm placing the inlay in my wet clear coat, and then I'm going to use my fingers to smooth that out, make sure there's good contact, and then I'm going to grab my mister. I'm going to mist the design, and then I'm going to grab a wet wipe and just go in and apply a bit more pressure again, making sure that I've got good contact with all areas. I'm then going to repeat the process with each of those other inlays. You may have noticed that I've already got a little bit of distressing going on in the top left and right hand corners there on my tray. When I flipped it over, I think I probably flipped it a little bit too soon, so I did have some of that paint come off on the cardboard that I was resting underneath. But in the end, I'm actually really happy with the result. It looks like quite authentic chipping and age, so we're just going to embrace it. Once I'm finished applying each of the inlays, I let them dry. That only took about 30 minutes. And then I came in with my mister and I'm going to mist each of the inlays that I've laid down, make sure that they're thoroughly wet. I then took a wet wipe just to, again, just dab it, make sure that it's thoroughly damp. After about 60 seconds, I can start pulling that inlay away. And again, this is just such a satisfying process when you see that that inlay has been left behind in your clear coat or paint, whatever you decide to use. I'm then going to be taking each of those inlays and setting them off to one side because I can get another 2 to 3 uses out of these. They'll just be progressively faded each time I use them. Next, I wanted to add something simple in the center. So I took out my brocante transfer. This is one of the scraps from that one, and I'm just going to be cutting this text out so that it fits in the different little slat sections there. This just says Rosa, it's something in French, and I thought it went really perfect with this design. It's just simple and subtle. So I'm going to position the transfer in the center and then use the transfer tool to start burnishing the design down. You'll see I also lift up a corner of the plastic and I lift it as I rub. I did miss a little section here, but I was able to just go back and rub that down. I think it was just a little full stop actually. Then I'm going to repeat the same process for the text that's going to sit on the bottom. Again, this is very subtle, but I felt like it just added a little bit of something special for the center. After further burnishing the transfers down with the carrier sheet, I then took some 220 grit sandpaper and I went around and did some light distressing on the edges, and I do also do a little bit of distressing on some of the inside sections, the little squares there. And then I did take this outside and I sealed it with Rust-Oleum's satin clear coat. Again, for this particular project, spraying on the product was a much easier alternative. And here's our finished tray. I love how this turned out. This tray was already very unique and adding those inlays gave it a lovely shabby chic vibe. Let me know what you think of this in the comments. Project, I'm going to be using this tray that I thrifted. I believe it's made out of resin. I've already sprayed it with Rust-Oleum's Clear Matte Sealer and now I'm going to give it 2 coats of Dixie Belle's Buttercream Chalk Mineral Paint. Remember, you can find a full product list in the description below and most of these products on our website, theprovincialfarmhouse.com.au. Once my 2 coats of paint have completely dried, I'm going to be using IOD's Trimmings 2 mold. They have this lovely rope trim that you can cast that looks very similar to candy cane. I was inspired to use this particular style of trim as candy cane by a photo I saw on IOD's Instagram page by Salty Harbour Treasures. So you can see I'm just working that clay into the mold and then using my thumb to push the excess clay out against that micro rim. Then I'm going to carefully pull that out and I'm going to have to make quite a few of these. We're going to be putting it around the top rim of the tray, so I'm going to keep making them until I have enough. And when it was time to do my last piece, I just cast a partial bit of the trim so that I could fit it in the excess space that I had to try and finish off the design. So I'm just positioning it in the gap that I have and then working out how much I'm going to have to tear off. I'm then going to use a quick set wood glue on the back of each of my pieces to glue them down. I'm also adding glue to the parts where the trim connects with the other piece of trim. And then once I have everything glued down, I'm going to give my tray another coat of that buttercream. I find that this reduces cracking and shrinking, so I'm going to cover the entire tray. And something that did happen, unfortunately, is that despite adding the paint, I still had quite a bit of space between each of my little trim pieces. I added the glue. I thought that this would work. Unfortunately, you'll see here in a second that I did get quite a lot of gaps between each of my pieces. Not too much cracking, but definitely quite a few gaps. So I'm going to show you here how I fixed that. I just took some more of my clay and I'm adding it into the gaps wherever they've formed, and this is the next day, so my clay is completely dry and I'm just working that clay into each of those little gaps. Once I have all of the gaps filled, I'm going to allow them to dry for several hours, and then I'm going to add a couple of coats of that buttercream so that we can match up that tone. Once my paint has completely dried, I'm going to be using IOD's new Candy Cane Cottage Transfer. I'm so excited to be finally using this, and I'm going to be grabbing, as you may have guessed, the Candy Cane Transfer design at the back. This is absolutely perfect for this tray, so I'm just going to position it in the center where I want it to go, and I am going to have to trim off those excess swirls in the corner. I can save those and use those later. They won't fit, and honestly, I don't think we need them because of the beautiful shape of this tray and because we've added that trim that we're going to make look like candy cane. So I've got it trimmed out to the size I want. I'm peeling off the backing. I'm positioning it in the center. The grid lines really help with this. And then I'm pressing it down. I like to go over the top of the whole design with my little plastic transfer tool to start off with to make sure it's all down. And then I pick a section and I start lifting that plastic, and I'm rubbing and burnishing the transfer down as I'm lifting. And if I miss any areas, I just put that plastic back down and I continue to rub until the design has transferred down. So these are very easy to use, and this is such a beautiful design. I'm then going to use my fingers just to make sure everything is pressed down, and then I'm using part of the carrier sheet to further burnish the design down. To seal my transfer, I'm using Paint Couture's Extreme Guard in satin, and I'm going to seal the entire tray with this. Once that clear coat is dry, I'm going to be using Dixie Belle's Muscadine Wine as my red today, and I have a small artist brush, and I'm going to be adding it to that rope trim that we laid down, and I'm going to be adding that red to every second piece. And this was quite fiddly, but if there was any areas that I went out of line, I was able to use a wet wipe to wipe up any errors. I don't mind if this isn't perfect. I'm definitely going for a vintage look. That's my favorite way to create. So it doesn't matter if each of these little sections aren't perfect, if they're not the same size, I'm just going to go with it. Once my red is completely dry, I'm going to use that same satin clear coat to seal everything in. Once that's dry, I'm going to be using some of Paint Couture's Van Dyke Brown Glaze, and I'm going to be using a brush, and I'm brushing it on to the tray, getting it into all of those cracks and crevices. I know a lot of you might be having a little bit of a heart attack now. Don't worry, I'm coming in with a wet wipe now and wiping back most of the excess. I really don't want this to be super heavy, but I do want this to have a vintage feel, and I want that glaze to work its way into the details to achieve that look. Now, if this isn't something that you don't like that aged look, you would leave this step out. If you don't have access to this particular glaze, a brown wax could definitely work, or you could create a paint wash with a water-based brown paint. I also added a small amount of that glaze to the center of our design, but again, I do wipe back most of that glaze. We don't need it to be dark. I just want a hint of age. Finally, I then took some of Paint Couture's Bronze Luxe Metallic. I have a little bit on a small artist brush, and I'm working that product into the little groove that runs around the edge of this tray. So there's a little indent that I'm working that product into. And once I have it worked into each of those sections, I'm going to be using a wet wipe to actually wipe back the excess from around the top of that particular section. So it'll just be sitting in the details, and of course I'm doing that to the entire border of this tray. And here's our finished candy cane tray. I love how this turned out. That transfer is absolutely gorgeous and it works perfectly with the trimmings to mold. Let me know what you think of this in the comments. I really hope that you enjoyed this video collection, and you can find the products used in this video on our website, theprovincialfarmhouse.com.au. If you haven't already, I would love it if you would hit that subscribe button, like, comment, and share this out to a friend that you think might enjoy it.